for this idea seminar, so it appears this year also, but this is a moving feast, as I hope you will see during this session. Now, since time is very short, what I'm going to do is, first of all, briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. Secondly, set out the issue, frame the issue that we're going to discuss, and then we will proceed with the panel discussion. Well, the title of the session is India and China Forging an Uneasy Alliance. Now, as we look at the two countries around the world, it seems that being large and populous and both growing and developing, they are engaging across a very complex series of fronts. On the one hand, there is global cooperation. There is Jairam Ramesh just saying in today's paper that the two delegations have met 6 times a day for the last week in Copenhagen. There are partnerships, other things happening. But at the same time, there is suspicion, there is mistrust, there has been more attention, and the ladies and gentlemen of the media in the last few months have kind of brought it to our attention in no uncertain terms. So we have a very complicated situation between us, which we have to make or try and make sense of. And most importantly, as the output of this seminar, if we can generate some new thoughts and creative ideas as to how to address this complexity. And that's what this distinguished and wonderful panel here is going to kick off with everyone's participation. So without further ado, let me introduce them. The introductions will be of very, very brief, by no means doing them justice. Indrani Bagchi, sitting right here, is diplomatic editor of the Times of India. Many of you would have read what she writes on a variety of subjects, and she is a strong and annual contributor, should I say, to this panel. Paul Beckett, sitting next, is the head of the South Asia Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. He has had enormous experience with journalism. The Wall Street Journal was particularly commended and awarded for its coverage of the Mumbai attacks in great depth. Welcome, Paul. The third speaker will be Nayan Chanda. Nayan is presently in Yale, but many of you might have read his pieces and remember him best for his editorship of the legendary Far Eastern Economic Review, which does not survive at the moment, at least not in its old form. And he has been prolific in writing about aspects of Asia ranging from the Far East right up to India. Our fourth panelist is Siddiq Wahid, sitting right at the other corner there. He is Vice Chancellor of the Islamic University, Kashmir, and the founder Vice Chancellor. He is a resident of Ladakh, so he actually brings knowledge and deep experience of a frontier region, the borderlands between India and China, which I'm sure he's going to touch upon. And our final speaker is Sanjay Labru, who is the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Ashai India Glass, the largest glass company in India, a prominent member of the Confederation of Indian Industry, where he currently is heading a task force looking at India-China business relationships. And I will not go through the large number of his other directorships, so on, where he is extremely active. So that's our panel. And let me kick off with the first question addressed to Indrani. Indrani, now given this complexity in India-China relationships, do you think India has the knowledge, the confidence, the perspective to address this wide range of issues in the manner they should be addressed? And if not, how do we create these capabilities?
Thank you, Ravi. I think we can develop the knowledge, perspective, and the confidence. At the present moment, there is an interesting lack of confidence in our ability to deal with China, and that is inexplicable given the fact that both India and China are rising powers. So there is a kind of there is a difficulty in understanding why India should be more worried and less confident when we regard China. There is of course we have a long historical baggage, but are we letting the historical baggage get overcome us and not be able to deal with China as two sovereign nations growing with concerns, with issues with each other, but with a confidence that you may be able to overcome these concerns? And the reason why I think that we don't have that confidence is our current lack of knowledge. While every Indian is a Pakistan expert, there is no Indian who is a China expert. And there is very little attempt at understanding China. We have now learned to see a China bogey behind every bush. But we haven't yet understood why we see the China bogey, or whether there is at all a China bogey in the first place, or whether China is interested in putting a bogey there at all. And that lack of knowledge is, in my opinion, dangerous in the short term. Certainly in the medium and long term, we are in danger of making the wrong decision because of our lack of understanding of China.
Thank you, Indrani. You've been admirably frank and self-critical, if I may put it that way. If I move to Paul now, you've heard, you must have gathered some of the flavor of what is happening in India vis-a-vis China, and of course from your perspective in the US, you have a kind of view from a distance, so to speak. So what's your take on what's going on over here and what India needs to do? Sure. Okay. 4 minutes.
I think India is in a very tight spot at the moment. Actually, I feel like partly because of the US, either intentionally or unintentionally, has created a situation where 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the US hugged India very, very close. New strategic alliances, geopolitics was realigned on a US-India axis. And it was really right after that China started to tweak India a lot more. And I think you see, there's actually a very good article on this in the Far Eastern Economic Review that talks about how just plotted China's increased aggressiveness on border issues and everything to the increased military cooperation and geopolitical cooperation between the United States and India. I think that India since has started to realize the limitations of that realignment, and to some degree is still trying to figure out how to deal with the fallout, because you saw under the Obama administration there's fairly starkly a very strong emphasis being put on China. And however many state dinners they hold at the White House, that's not going to really compensate for the fact that China looms very large in U.S. foreign policy in the new White House. So I think India, as a result, feels, in some ways rightly, feels probably a little out in the cold, and like it's a little brother keeps jumping up for attention when these two adults are speaking. And the result is that the response from the Indian side, I don't think India has helped itself in many ways, because it seems whenever China pokes India, India comes up with exactly the response that China would expect. There's still it seems like there's an element here where there's still a sense that there's lingering sentiment over the war. Whatever it is, that if there's in a void of a clear policy that India wants to pursue, there's still too many, they're out to get us, there's going to be another war, we're going to lose. I was just astonished, just sitting in my office about 3 or 4 months ago, to see on the headlines, Air Chief, I think it was a senior Air Force officer anyway, declares that India has 1/3 of the air power that China possesses. And I immediately thought, well, we're in a way of war. what an extraordinary thing out of the blue to have run across your television screen. For now, it just seems like India responds in a way that is not very helpful in these situations because it tends to show all of the insecurities that to some degree are justified, but which I would say India needs to find a way to get over. And if that means being tough with the United States and saying to the United States, look, if you're serious about geopolitical partnership, you can't leave us in the cold while you deal with China. And I think that's something that's well worth saying.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, both of you, for strictly adhering to the 4-minute schedule. Nayan, let me come to you. You had a perspective earlier in the Far East, now from Yale, of looking across Asia. Is there something that you see, looking at the same landscape, the geography is the same, the history is the same, at least in terms of objective facts, but do China and India read the different regions of Asia differently? What's your perspective?
What is striking about India-China relations is the asymmetry of their threat perception. In the asymmetry of the threat perception, the Chinese have created a narrative in which China is not threatened by India. If you study Chinese press, Chinese official document, there is never a word India threat. Chinese present India as somewhat misunderstanding Chinese intention, or perhaps being paranoid, and by presenting India in a benign light, Chinese can then justify what they're doing with India's neighbors. Although it is containment, but Chinese can present it as a benign help to all these poor neighbors. It is nothing against India, because India is not a threat. So by presenting a narrative which presents China as a benign power helping smaller countries, and India is not a threat, Chinese have the moral upper ground. As opposed to that, India is always talking about China threat, especially since the nuclear explosion, which was justified by the Chinese threat. India appears to be whining all the time, that there is something happening. India, China has to deal with Pakistan, or not something with Burma or Bangladesh. India is very upset, and India's media is talking about that China threat. So this makes India actually look both insecure and aggressive, whereas Chinese appear to be much more mature and benign country, which is kind of has to deal with India's insecurity, which is not really realistic. And this asymmetric perception is, in case of China, is possible because Chinese media is controlled by the government. So what Chinese media says, Chinese government says, they are all in sync. There is no China-India threat in the Chinese media. Whereas Indian newspapers are running wild with stories about immediate attack and all that. That makes India look like a very insecure nation, which India should not be. Because in my view, China has a serious internal problem. China does face a threat of different type. China doesn't face a threat from either India or United States as such. China's threat is internal, and Chinese are always concerned about external forces helping their internal threat, and that is the Chinese concern. But the way India reacts to every Chinese move makes India appear to be actually reaching for a fight with China or feeling very insecure about China.
Thank you, Nayan. Siddiq, Nayan has just given us a very interesting picture of the scenario being the same, and but a so-called benign approach as seen from China, and insecure approach as seen from India. But can I ask you, you come from the borderlands where these two countries meet, and is there something more fundamentally different between India and China? Are there basic differences in worldview which would make the coming together or cooperation of these countries not impossible, but difficult?
I mean, I don't know about world views, but certainly historical experiences are very, very different. And I think it's best illustrated or very aptly illustrated by the fact that China built a 2,500-mile long wall in order to protect itself from the barbarians. Whereas India or South Asia as a whole has a 2,500-mile long wall naturally built in the Himalaya and has succeeded in allowing it to be breached at every single turn, all the way from Jammu and Kashmir to Arunachal. And I think that that this illustrates two different worldviews. That wall, of course, was breached most emphatically between 1947 and 1959 with the Tibetan case and bringing really the People's Republic of China right next door onto the borders. I think there are other aspects to the historical experience that are very different. Number one, China was never colonized and therefore has a worldview which is, shall we say, much more confident and in fact centralized view of governance and idea. The other thing is that China's direct engagement with the West in modern times started as early as the mid-19th century with the Opium Wars, which made it confront the largest empire of the time and therefore start to learn about the modern environment, if you will, at a much earlier age in a direct sort of way. And finally, it had something called the Maoist revolution or the communist revolution, as well as the cultural revolution in the mid-19th century, mid-20th century, almost exactly 100 years after the Opium Wars, which basically put it front and center in the modern world in terms of its acknowledgement and ownership, taking ownership of this thing called a completely modern perspective. I think that it would be fair to say that our sort of plunge into modernity has been somewhat of a much different route, which I'm not going to sort of emphasize. I think the symptoms of this are all over the place. Number one, China has 16 neighbors or neighbor countries. Examine it, look at it, and more or less all the relationships are even keel. And with us, I mean, being equal in size, almost population-wise at least, we're looking at a relationship which is not terrible. I mean, it's there. It's a rivalry, but so. We have 6 neighbors in India, and if we really examine it, how many of them are confident about their relationship with the Republic of India? So I think, yes, is it improbable that that friendly relationships can be established? I don't think so. I mean, I think that it will be difficult, as you said. It will be difficult, but it has to be looked at squarely in the face, rather than us being in denial. And I'll close with this quick anecdote, and that was that recently I was talking to a very senior army officer and asked him about the talk that was going on about rocks being painted in Ladakh, or the Ladakh side of the border, or something like that. And he, it was right at that time, and his response was, no, our relationships with China are fantastic, they're very good. Historically, I think going back to the 1st century AD, he went all the way from there, saying how historically we're all connected. Well, I mean, historically the world is connected. It's not as if there was some disconnection. So, difficult, yes.
Thank you, Siddiq. Let's shift gears and move to Sanjay, who, as in my introduction I mentioned, is strongly involved in the business community and first-hand knowledge with China in regards to business. Now, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Premier Wen Jiabao at a meeting, I think about a year and a half ago, said there's enough space in the world for both India and China to grow. From your perspective as a business person, what do you think India should do to realize this dream of both countries growing and having the space to grow?
I think I'll start by saying that we should have a perspective on, what is China and what is India. I mean, I think we flatter ourselves by even using that term Chindia or India-China. A very dear friend of mine, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, I asked him this question. I said, how do you think of China towards India? And he said, this hyphenation is not justified. I think Pakistan made the mistake of trying to be like India, and they didn't have the resources to do it. And we have to recognize that China is miles ahead. I mean, I can give you statistics. And in any area, whether it's steel production, automobile production, in healthcare, in the number of doctors per 1,000 people, they are miles ahead. In their trade, they are almost at 10% of surplus to their GDP, trade surplus to GDP, while we are at -7%. So we are two different animals. The only two areas where we are better than them is our population growth rate is 3 times theirs, and our movie production is 3 times theirs. Everywhere else, we are far behind. So we have to see that we have to learn actually from China as to what is it they have done to accelerate their growth in the manner they have done and lift so many people out of extreme poverty. Having said that, there is a problem between India and China, and when we say we must coexist, everybody at a theoretical level can agree to that. But on a practical level, their strategy has been investment-led, export-led. There's a saying out there which goes, buy local, sell global. And in manufacturing, you can see their performance. I mean, they export almost $1,400 billion, and most of it is manufacturing. And when it comes to India, if you see 5 years ago, we had a total trade between China and India of 3 billion with a 2 billion deficit, which last year became 40 billion with a 20 billion deficit, and 3 years from now, guaranteed, will be 60 billion with a 40 billion deficit. They are our largest trade partner, and we, as all the panelists have said, we know so little. So I think we really need to engage, but we also have to understand that what China does might not be beneficial for us. It might not be a plus or a 1 + 1 = 3 synergy kind of thing. We have to look after our interests. We have to make sure that if they want to sell to us, and if you see the composition of what they sell to us, 90% is equipment, electronics, telecom, and if you look at ours to them, 90% is iron ore, bauxite and minerals, that we have to insist that they also do certain value addition here, that they also bring their investments in here. Otherwise, it's a very skewed relationship, which is not beneficial for India so far. Except it creates disinflation, but we really need manufacturing because we need to generate 300 million jobs. And that can only happen through manufacturing.
Thank you, Sanjay. And let me thank all the panelists for admirable timekeeping, because it gives us whatever few minutes we have, we can use for audience interaction. So let's now move into the second round. We've outlined the issues so far, and now let's move to a discussion amongst the panelists, keeping in mind that the objective is to generate some creative ideas to move ahead and tackle these issues for the future. We just established that it is an asymmetric relationship, not only psychologically between India and China, but also, as Sanjay has reminded us, in terms of actual GDP, size and economic clout. We are coming to it with some baggage and some historical difficulties. So in this kind of situation, given that that's where we are, what are the creative things, ideas we can do to move forward? So I'm going to now start in reverse order, and let's limit ourselves to 2 to 2.5 minutes each, so that we have no more than one round. We should certainly not spend more than 18 minutes on this second round. So Sanjay, back to you.
I think I can, because I'm restricting myself to trade, I think I can give an example of something which really works. You look at our power sector. Clearly, if you look at this plan and the next plan, we need something like over 120,000 megawatts of power, and there's no way we have the capacity to actually make the capital equipment for that. So we need to go out, and I think China offers a great value proposition if you see their quality and cost equation that they give. So we should use that, but we should use that leverage to get them to invest here. I'm not saying close the doors on them. I'm just saying we should have a more open and equal relationship. Now, NTPC has done a wonderful thing. They have a tender going out for 11 into 660 megawatt power turbines. And they have opened a tender where the condition is that if you want to supply to us, there has to be 40% value addition in India. So, you will compel these people to come and invest here, and then let them compete openly with any Indian BHEL or Crompton or whoever else is there. I think they've done the same thing. They have directed investments into the areas they have liked by specifying the amounts you can invest, by specifying the sectors you can invest in, and more than that, they have also identified the areas. Like if you want to go in automotive, you've got to localize 45%, but within that 45%, the transmission has to be done, or the powertrain has to be done. I don't want to say that we should go back to this phased manufacturing program or forced localization. But if you are going to invest, if you're going to sell to us, you should also invest. A quid pro quo. So I think there are many ways we can engage with them. On the other side, there's a lot we can learn from them. They have something like between a 27% to a 40% advantage on cost by 3 factors. One is things they do well, second is they have certain price subsidies, and thirdly they have some cost subsidies. So I'm saying at least look at the part where they do so much better than us, the clustering they do, the vertical integration that they do, the superiority of their logistics and infrastructure that they have, the work ethic they have. We should have a much more open relationship with them. Many of us should go for our holidays there too. You know, on a cultural level, we should engage with that country to learn from them.
Thank you, Sanjay, for some very concrete suggestions on how we can move forward. Siddiq?
I'm assuming we stick to our own subjects, which I would like to do, actually.
Okay, but you're free to comment on anything the other panelists have said.
Thank you. I think that, between the late 19th century and the early end of the 20th century, the world underwent a sea change. From very large political spaces, we ended up having huge economic and small economic spaces in the early part of the 20th century. We've ended up having very large economic, perhaps just one economic space called globalization, and smaller and smaller political spaces starting to be allowed. And in that sense, I think that both India and China can learn from each other to begin with, but also China learn a little more from India, in the sense that allowing for participatory democracy and allowing for open societies. I think that this is it. And China's minorities, although mentioned in many terms, or minorities, basically we're talking about 2 or 3 rather large minorities. The Uyghur in Xinjiang, the Tibetan, and perhaps to some extent Manchu and Manchurian. Allowing for political spaces within them, because I think that it poses. So in that sense, different from the other presentations, I think that there is something that India can engage with China on politically, if it is brave enough, or a little bit more bold, as has been put also, in terms of what it can engage with China on the political front. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddiq. That was really a very interesting suggestion. Let me now move to you, Nayan.
I'd like to come back to what Paul was saying about the United States-India relations in connection with China. Chinese actually saw India as a threat only after the India-China, nuclear framework agreement was achieved. In 2005, People's Daily published an editorial in which they mentioned that they can blame the US for drawing India into some sort of alliance to harm China's interests. So India was not really the culprit. Culprit was the United States. But for the first time, India was actually presented as some sort of threat to the US in connection to China, in connection with its alliance with the US. But that acceptance of India as a threat led China to actually sign an MOU with India in 2006 for military cooperation. So that was the first time China actually did that. So that when India-US relations made China more worried about India and led to the MOU. So the conclusion I draw from this is that India on its own poses no threat to China. Chinese know that, and they don't talk about it, and they present India as a sort of country which doesn't understand China's intention, and perhaps they misled. Whereas if India is seen as joining the United States in either containing China or curbing Chinese influence, then India is a threat. And that's why the recent spate of pinpricks by the Chinese, the pressure on India, is directly related to the India-US cooperation and military joint exercises and stuff like that.
Okay. Thanks. And maybe Paul, you might be able to amplify on this particular point, because this thought was triggered by something you said. Okay, where do we go then from there?
I do think that India needs to come up with a way to get China worried about the consequences of its continuous poaching. And I just think it needs to find a way that the Chinese say, don't do that because it'll be a cost to us for doing that. And right now there is no cost for however progressive it wants to do. With regards to the United States, I do think they also need to make sure that they don't get lost in the shuffle, as I said before. Not lost in the shuffle, but just sort of kept a little bit at bay as the US and China try to figure things out. I think the US probably has a feeling, if you asked for people in the State Department, well, what about India? They'd say things with India are fine, so we don't need to worry about it. This is a long-term game that we're in with India. We're all growing together. We're getting closer. This is all very happy. China's the problem, so China's the thing that we need to focus on. And I think India needs to get in the middle of that conversation and say, no, we are feeling threatened, that we need America's help to make sure that there is some consequence to China's poking around. But ultimately, I still feel like it's if you are a middleweight boxer and you're facing a heavyweight boxer, the answer is not to say, he's bigger than me and I don't like it when he keeps poking me. Right? The answer is to become a heavyweight boxer yourself, who's in better shape and who's stronger and who can really take them on and give the guy something to be worried about. So India's ultimate answer is not to keep getting worried by, to have this Pavlovian response to China's, to what it sees as a China threat, and to get its own house in order, and to fix India. And once India is being fixed, and once China can see that India is being fixed, then it's going to be a much better prospect that the Chinese will take much greater notice of the consequences of the relationship that they have. And I just don't think there's any other way to do it than for India to say, let's just put China over there for a moment and let's get our house in order. I also think that democracy is something that is very imperfect in this country, but it's still something that India does a very poor job of projecting as being a real asset of Indian society, which is one thing, I wouldn't say one thing, I'm sure there are others, but it's the major thing that India has that China doesn't, and that it can really use some leverage on. And I don't think India does a good job in leveraging the fact that in populations of a similar size, one is free to determine its own political future and the other isn't. And I do think that's a card that India could do a much better job of playing.
Thank you very much, Paul. And Rani, you get the last word on this in this round.
Well, certainly after, I know we've sort of hit ourselves repeatedly in the last half an hour. And I just wanted to say that a couple of things. One is, notwithstanding our lack of knowledge or our lack of perspective about China, I think we should all be very clear that China is and will be a source of anxiety, strategic anxiety to India. We could even call it a threat without sort of breaking the bank. But the fact remains that we cannot deal with China like we deal with, say, Pakistan. We have to deal with China in a much more sophisticated way. And among the first things that we should be doing, and doing really sort of put our hearts and minds into this, is to beef up the border, to develop our side of the border in quite the way that the Chinese have done on their side of the border, because it is one of the reasons why India is constantly poked by China on the border, is that their access to the border is far easier, far better than our access to the border, for the simple reason that for 50 years we thought that India's strategic idea was if you kept the borders underdeveloped, the Chinese wouldn't be able to come across, which is completely ridiculous. And you are now at a situation, and I'll just describe a tiny incident to you, which is when there are now big construction activities going on the Indian side of the border. There is also corresponding activities going on the Chinese side of the border, and it's clear to anybody that on their side it's so much better, so much easier, so much broader than on the Indian side. But because among every other problem that we have, we also have more forests and going up to the border. This is a small incident. Sort of if you're moving their roads up to the border, but cutting down trees on our side of the border meant that a case was filed at the Supreme Court, which then told the Indian government that you really shouldn't be cutting down all these trees over here. There is an elephant corridor that you need to protect, so you cannot have a road right up to the border. These are very real constraints that our people do face, and we must recognize it. And it then took a very enterprising bureaucrat to do something interesting, which is he piled up the construction crews and construction material into planes and flew them across to the point where the Indian perception of the border was, and worked the road back from the border rather than building the road up to the border. I mean, this is obviously, you're actually working around the system, but I think we should also be a little fair that the system in India is not as easy when it comes to projects of this nature as it is on the Chinese side. On the Chinese side, they really don't have to go back to the Supreme Court for environmental clearance. They don't have to do all of that. In India, they do have to do it, and you have to recognize that. But that is not an excuse for the fact that you really haven't done what you were supposed to do. It was only in 2007 that you had the first report from the Indian government to say that these are the things that need to be done on the border. These are the airfields that need to be restarted again. So yes, we are behind the curve. And the reason, as I keep going back, we are behind the curve is because we have very little knowledge of China's intentions. We put a whole lot of intentions to China, and a lot of them may well be true, but we don't know for certain. And because we haven't invested in domain knowledge on China, I think we are suffering, and I think that is one of the things that we need to work on instantly.
Thank you very much, Rani. Thank you very much. Thank you.